Of you know, a few weeks ago, Greg's mother came to stay with us, and when she left our house, she left behind a few magazines that she read on the airplane. And one of them was a magazine that was entirely devoted to the royals. And it wasn't just the British royal family. I mean, of course, that was the cover story, was Prince William and Kate Middleton and little baby George and Prince Harry, but it also featured the young royals of other principalities around the world. And the magazine was really like a glimpse into their lives of wealth and privilege and prestige. So there were beautiful pictures of the palaces that they lived in, and the clothes that they wear, and the cars that they drive. And they showed pictures of, whenever they appear in public, how crowds of people flock in great excitement to see them. And they curtsy and bow before them and hand them flowers and gifts. Now, this fascination with royalty is not a new thing. Our people have been fascinated with kings and queens and princes and princesses since the beginning of recorded time. And most of us, of course, we grew up with bedtime stories and fairy tales that were set in castles or in ivory towers, and the princess was waiting for her prince to come, and they were going to live happily ever after. Now, the people of Jesus' time were also really fixated on kingdoms and on kings. The kings were like the celebrities of their time because they were the ones who had the privilege and the prestige and the wealth and the power. So they had the power to send in armies to take control of foreign lands. And they had the power to lord and rule over people. They had the power to build big walled cities to keep strangers out. And they had the power to accumulate more and more wealth for themselves. And the people were the lowly servants. They were the loyal subjects who would bow and worship before them, some out of devotion, but many out of fear. Now, the people of Jesus' time heard a lot of stories about kings, biblical kings, kings like King David, who were called by God. So they were looking for who the king was going to be that was going to save them. And when Jesus appears on the scene, they go, there he is, that's the king. We're going to proclaim him the king. Well, today, November 22nd, Christian churches around the globe, many of them celebrate the feast day today, which is the feast of Christ the King. Now, many of us who grew up in Christian churches, we grew up referring to Jesus as the King. And we sang songs in church like Hosanna to our King, and to Jesus Christ our sovereign King. And there's lots of works of art, I'm sure you've seen them, of Jesus sitting on a throne with a gold crown, holding a bejeweled scepter. I think all of this king worship would make Jesus very sad, because that's not what he wanted. Look in the Gospels, not just today's Gospel, but throughout the Gospels. Whenever people were trying to proclaim Jesus as king, he rejected it. So you remember the story of the loaves and the fishes. After Jesus fed the thousands, they all started proclaiming, "This is our king." And the next sentence said, when Jesus heard this, he immediately ran into hiding. He could have proclaimed himself king right then and there. He ran and hid. Then we know when Jesus is coming into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, the crowds are cheering. They're welcoming in the king. And instead of riding in on a big war horse like a king would, Jesus comes in riding on the back of a donkey. He's purposely making a sign to say, I'm not the king that you want me to be. And then, of course, at the Last Supper, his apostles still think he's going to be the king they have in mind. He surprises them because he gets down on his knees and he washes their feet. This is not something a king would do. But Jesus is saying, my kingdom is the opposite of the kings and kingdoms that you have in mind. My kingdom is not about wealth. In fact, I'm telling you to sell your possessions. And my kingdom is not about prestige. I want you to esteem others better than yourself. And my kingdom isn't about building big walled cities to keep people out. I want you to welcome in strangers. And my kingdom is not one about power and dominion and being number one. What I instruct you to do if you want to be number one is to be the servant and to lower yourself. That's what I want you to do. It is the total opposite of what people thought a king and a kingdom was all about. Now, I grew up Catholic, and the Pope, in many ways, was like a king. The Pope lived in the papal palace, this gorgeous place, and he would appear from time to time high up on a balcony, waving to the people. And he wore Prada slippers. And people kissed his ring. Pope Francis has been remarkable because he's rejected all that. He doesn't live in a palace. He lives in a rented apartment. He's among the people. And right after he became Pope, one of the very first things he did was he went to a prison. And he washed the feet of murderers and criminals. Pope Francis is a new kind of pope that people haven't seen before. And Jesus was a new kind of king, and people couldn't wrap their heads around it. Jesus is saying to them, don't make me king. I don't want to be king. It's not about me. It's about you. That's what Jesus is telling us to do. He is saying to us, I want you not to worship me, but to be like me. I want you to relinquish power. I want you to love your enemies. I want you to serve others, especially those in need. And I want you to welcome in strangers. That's what I want you to do. Now, this past week, after the attacks in Paris, we have heard many voices from people who are so-called Christians who are instructing us to do the opposite of what Jesus commanded us. These people, these leaders, are proclaiming Jesus as their king, and they forgot that their king himself was a refugee, that their king had to be born in a stable because no one would take in his Middle Eastern teenage pregnant mother. If you truly want to keep Christ in Christmas, stop worshiping a king and start bringing about the kingdom. That's what Jesus wanted. Stop living in a fairy tale waiting for your prince to come and to fix everything and make everything wonderful. That isn't what Jesus wanted from us. He wanted for us to bring about the kingdom. That's why he said, the kingdom is within you. You have to bring it about. But now, 2,000 years after Jesus' death, we still haven't brought it about. We still haven't done it. Which might lead some to believe Christianity must be a failure. Gandhi was once asked that, and he said, Christianity is not a failure. Christianity hasn't even been tried yet, is what he said. And sadly, that is the truth. It is so much easier for us to be the lowly, loyal subjects, praising a king who's going to make everything better, rather than taking responsibility for bringing about the kingdom. It's in us. We've got to bring it forth. Next Sunday is the first Sunday of Advent. It's the time of preparation, of taking the light that's within us and birthing it into the world. That's what Jesus wants us to do. Now, after the attacks in Paris, when everyone was hashtagging Pray for Paris, the Dalai Lama said this: we cannot solve this problem only through prayers. I believe in praying, but humans have created this problem, and now we're asking God to solve it? It's illogical. God would say, solve it yourself, because you created it in the first place. We, as Christians, have created a religion in which we praise a king and say, please fix all of our problems. We're begging and beseeching you. And Jesus, if you look at his words, he never said, I want you to do that. He said, I came so that you could bring about the kingdom. You are the light of the world. That's what he said. So in our words of integration this morning by Reverend Chris Glazer, he says the same thing. We have to start taking responsibility. If you want the reign of God now, if you want to bring about the kingdom of heaven on earth, like Jesus instructed us to do, then what you have to do is you have to stop following the ways of the king, the earthly kings. We have to reject the ways of the earthly kings who think that leadership and power means the one who has the strongest voice, the one who forces people to do things this way. Jesus was the opposite of that. He said, turn the other cheek, love your enemies, welcome in strangers. That's how we're going to bring about the kingdom of heaven on earth, is if we do those things that he did, but we don't want to do them. And then we're wondering why the world is in the shape that it's in. If we as Christians really followed all of Jesus' instructions, we could bring about the kingdom of heaven on earth right now. The reign of God could exist right now. But it's easier to worship a king than to actually do the work it involves to make the kingdom happen.